When people talk about Warp Server, they're generally talking about either Warp 4 Server or even Warp 4.5 Server for e-business. But there was actually a version which predates this. Warp Server version 3, released in early 1996. Let's step back a moment and see how we got to Warp Server 3. OS2 Warp, or OS2 version 3, was released in October 1994. It was the natural successor to OS2 2.1, and it included support for Windows 3.11 applications, as well as a number of interface enhancements such as the Launchpad, which you can see at the bottom of the screen here. Despite being marketed as a competitor to Windows for Workgroups 3.11 and even Windows 95, it didn't actually ship with any network or internet connectivity out of the box. Hence, OS2 Warp Connect, released in May 1995. OS2 Warp Connect was the same core OS2 Warp code, but with the addition of both local area network and internet connectivity. Internet connectivity was by way of IBM Internet Connection for OS2. This was essentially dial-up internet services, including additional internet applications such as a web browser, newsreader client, Gopher client, and a few other utilities you can see here. LAN connectivity was provided by either Peer for OS2 for peer-to-peer workgroup style networks, or LAN Requester 4 for more traditional office networks. With the Peer for OS2 client, the OS2 workstation functioned like a traditional workstation and was able to connect to shared drives and shared printers on other workstations or servers on the network. But there was no centralized username and password control. If you wanted to connect to a shared folder on server A, you had to have a distinct username and password for that server. And that might be different to the username and password you used for server B, and so on. By contrast, LAN Requester 4 was used to connect your workstation to an IBM LAN Server network, which then provided centralized username and password along with access to shared resources all over the network using that same single username and password. But it was a complicated standalone product which installed on top of OS2 2.1 with, let's say, mixed results. And that takes us to OS2 Warp Server version 3. This was released in early 1996 and predates OS2 Warp 4 by at least 6 months. Warp Server version 3 built on Warp Connect by adding an upgraded edition of IBM LAN Server version 5 to provide file and print sharing, a remote access server, remote management systems, advanced print services, and even a network gateway. It was, of course, intended to be a rival for both Windows NT and the market leader at the time, Novell NetWare. It was also intended to be a valid upgrade path for existing IBM LAN Manager for OS2 users. By including all of these additional network service components as part of the installation, IBM were clearly trying to demonstrate both ease of use and ease of installation, rather than the previous method, which was a separate add-on for almost everything. This was 1996, so remember it predates Microsoft Active Directory, which means that domains are not built around TCP/IP and DNS. They're built around NetBIOS and NetBEUI for Microsoft and IBM networks, or IPX/SPX for Novell NetWare networks. TCP/IP is a thing, but it's mainly used for WAN connections and very large networks. It's generally not used for small office networks. Nevertheless, OS2 Warp Connect and OS2 Warp Server both fully support TCP/IP for local networks, and we'll be using that today as part of configuring and demonstrating Warp Server. What you see here is my IBM PC 300GL running OS2 Warp Server version 3. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll know that this is my OS2 workhorse, which I use for a lot of these demonstrations. It has a Pentium 2 CPU, 196 gigs of RAM, and a compact flash reader to replace the IDE hard drive. The first thing to look at is the network protocols we're running. To do this, we're going to drop to a command prompt and run mpts. We click configure and then configure again, and then you'll see that in this computer I have a 3COM 3C903 network card and I'm running 3 specific protocols. There's IBM NetBIOS, IBM NetBIOS over TCP/IP, and IBM TCP/IP. I couldn't tell you whether we definitely need both NetBIOS variants. I do know that I had some file and print sharing errors when I used just TCP/IP, and since IBM domains were NetBIOS based domains, it makes sense that we need at least one of these. I added both, and it's working fine, as we'll see later. There's a quirk which means we can't have both NetBIOS and NetBIOS over TCP/IP running on the same virtual network adapter. So that's why you see the 0, 1 and 0 to the left of the protocols. Yes, I did say virtual network adapter, even though this is real physical hardware. As I understand it, OS2 internally virtualizes these network adapters so that you can run multiple network protocols on a single physical adapter. Alright, with MPTS configured, let's take a quick look at the TCP/IP configuration on this computer. The IP address is 192.168.34.60. The gateway is 192.168.34.1. And it's called Wood Owl. A single DNS server is specified because that's all you're asked for when configuring TCP/IP as part of installing Warp Server. But if this was a production network, it would of course be good practice to add an additional name server here. Let's quickly test TCP/IP by pinging something. There we go, working perfectly. Let's first take a quick look at the Warp Server components before we move on to today's focus, LAN Server. To do that, we go to OS2 System, then System Setup, then OS2 Warp Server Installation. If you're installing Warp Server on a blank drive, the server components are displayed as part of the regular installation process. You see them after you've selected your hardware and selected the regular OS2 Warp components you're going to install, for example the built-in games and utilities. You can also install Warp Server on top of OS2 Warp, and in which case you simply run the server installation program from within OS2 Warp. That installs whatever components you select, and it also places a shortcut to the installer in the OS2 System Setup folder. It takes a moment to rescan network hardware and then gives us a choice of easy installation or advanced installation. Easy installation is essentially a guided installation path. I'm going to use advanced installation because I don't actually want to make any changes. I just want to show you the server components available. If you type in your name and company here, it makes suggestions later on when setting up the domain. I'm going to leave them blank and carry on. And here we see the options. File and print sharing services is essentially IBM LAN Server, which we're going to focus on today. This is also where you choose to install NetWare Gateway support. This essentially allows the Warp Server to act as a gateway to NetWare servers and services on the network. OS2 Warp Server then presents those NetWare shares to OS2 Warp Server clients as regular OS2 Warp Server resources. TCP/IP services gives us TCP/IP. Without it, we just have NetBIOS. As you can see, it also gives us an option to install a DHCP server and a dynamic DNS server. Remote Access Services is for remote dial-in users to access this computer using a modem or modem pool. System Management Services allows you to inventory and manage computers on your network, including remote software installation. It's the forerunner to Tivoli, if you ever used that. Backup and Recovery Services provides basic backup options to a number of different media types. It's not a system I've previously used, but we'll take a look at it in more detail in a future video. And finally, Advanced Print Services. This allows you to print PostScript files on non-PostScript printers and to share that service over the LAN. We'll cancel out of all of this and we'll go back to the desktop. Before we take a look at LAN Server or file and print sharing, we're going to set up our shared folders and populate them with some placeholder files. OS2 Warp Server includes WinOS2, so I'm going to use a combination of the OS2 command prompt and Windows Notepad for that. We're going to drop to a command prompt, and we're going to create a folder in the router drive C under which I'll create all the individual shared folders. So we need our root shared folder, and then we're creating HR, Finance, and IT. And then within IT, we're going to create Docs, Programs, and Processes. Then back in our root shared folder, we create Home, and then within Home, we create a folder for Richard and a folder for Chloe. Alright, with our folders created, let's take a look at the IBM LAN Server component. This is what you'd use for file and print sharing on an IBM network. It includes clients for OS2, DOS, Windows 3, and even Windows 95. To get to that, we go to LAN Services File and Print, and then LAN Server Administrator. You can see the domain name here is Rick's Labs. That's what I chose when I set this up initially. We log on with the same username and password I specified during the installation. The logon process takes a moment, and then it'll give us an OK and a welcome message, and it'll show us a few more icons. The local workstation icon allows us to see the network services running on this server. But in order to manage the domain, we double-click on the Rick's Labs icon. OS2 Warp Server includes some fairly extensive online documentation installed alongside the product by default, and they refer to that icon as the castle. Of principal interest to us here are the user accounts, the groups, and the resource definitions. Let's take a look at user accounts first. Here we can see the user account created when I set up the domain, so we'll take a look at this before setting up a new user. On the Privileges tab, you'll see the system has created this account as an administrator by default. Under Home Directory, we're going to map this as Drive H on the connecting client. We use the server drop-down to specify the server on which our home directory is stored, and that's this server, WoodOwl. And then we specify the full path to that share, and that's C, shared, home, Richard. And then we click Set at bottom left, and we're all done. Okay, let's create a new user so we can see that process from scratch. If you've used OS2 Warp, you'll know that IBM called it an object-oriented operating system. What this means is that in order to create a new user, we make a copy of the user ID template, which immediately prompts us for the user details. So with our right mouse button, we drag and drop the user ID template onto a blank area of the user's window. Then we give our new account a name, so I'm going to choose Chloe. It's limited to 8 characters and it's not case sensitive. We're going to set a password, and then on privileges we'll see that Chloe is a regular user with no admin privileges. And then for home directory, I'm going to assign Chloe's home directory just like we did for Richard. And then we click on Create. We've got 2 users now, so my next step is to create a few groups for the folders we're going to share over the network. We created 3 folders earlier: Finance, HR, and IT. We'll create groups for the first 2, but we'll assign share permissions to the IT folder to specific users so we can see how that differs. We'll close our user accounts window and we'll open groups. And here we can see the default groups created during installation. Just like with user accounts, we create a new group by right-clicking and dragging the group template to an empty area. We give our group a name, so Finance, then we select the User tab, we add, and we select our two users, add again, and then create. And then we do the same for HR. Give it a name, and we select our users, and create. Now we want to share those folders we created earlier, and we want to apply shared permissions based on the groups we've just created. Shared folders come under Resource Definitions in Warp Server, so that's where we go next. We don't need to explicitly share the home folders. Warp Server will do that for us since we specified them on each user account object. As with user accounts and groups, we create new shared folders by right-clicking and dragging our directory template to a blank area of the window. We give the folder an alias or name, so we're going to start with Finance. I'll come back to the alias point later, as it's a similar concept to Microsoft's DFS or Distributed File Service. We use the drop-down to select this server, and then we type the path, C shared finance. Then we click on Create. Now we go to Permissions, and we want to add our finance group that we created earlier. And we're going to give that group all permissions except for the ability to modify permissions on the object itself. And that's finance created. And now we'll do the same with HR. Specify the server, specify the path, add our users, actually the group, and again all permissions except the ability to change permissions. And then we've got one more to do, our IT share. Wood Owl is the server, and the path is C shared IT. And for this one, I'm just going to give Richard access. And again, all permissions except changing permissions. Alright. You might wonder how OS2 Server is doing this, since HPFS doesn't have the concept of file and folder security like NTFS does. Well, when you install Warp Server, you also install HPFS 386, a modified version of HPFS which includes security attributes. That also means you can't install OS2 Warp Server on a FAT partition if you want to share files and folders. It must be formatted as HPFS. Now that we've created and shared those folders, let's create a few dummy files in each so that we can see how they look to a connecting client. I'm going to use Windows Notepad to create a few text files. So that will be in OS2 System, then WinOS2 Groups, WinOS2 Accessories, and Notepad. So we're going to write a little bit of text here, and then we're going to save this down into Finance. And then we want to do HR. And then we want to do IT. And we're going to put that in the Docs subfolder in IT. Okay, and now we're going to do a couple of files for our two users, Richard and Chloe. So this is Richard's. And now Chloe's. All done. Now I want to show you a little gotcha about long file names. Remember we created a subfolder of IT called Processes. Well, Processes is 9 letters long, so that's longer than the traditional 8.3 format that was supported on FAT and therefore known by DOS and Windows. Unfortunately, unlike Windows 95, Windows 3 doesn't have any form of long file name support, so it can't even see that folder. If we edit some text again, and then go to File, Save As, and we go to our IT share, we can't even see that Processes subfolder at all. So that's just something to watch out for when you're mixing OS2 and anything pre-Windows 95. Alright, that's our server setup complete. Time to move on to the client. Warp Server comes with a client for regular OS2 Warp on the CD, as well as for DOS, Windows 3.1, and even Windows 95. In preparation for this video, I actually tried to install the Warp Server client on a vanilla OS2 Warp installation, but it didn't go well. The installation completed successfully, but on reboot I got an error referencing PM merge and DOSCall1, which halted the system. So instead, I turned to OS2 Warp Connect, which, as I mentioned earlier, came with an IBM LAN Manager client as part of the product, so I didn't have to install anything extra. What we're looking at now is my IBM ThinkPad 380Z. This is one of my favourite IBM ThinkPad laptops. And just like with OS2 Warp Server, you can change your network client components after installation. I'll show you that now so that you can see what I've installed on my ThinkPad to make it all work. We go to OS2 System, OS2 Warp Connect Install Remove, and then Warp Connect Selective Install for networking. We choose a local install on this workstation, and then again we choose Advanced Installation. Now it's not showing you here what I chose during installation, but I'll show you what I chose. We need one of the client products, but I wasn't initially sure which one. Peer for OS2 sounded to me like the workgroup-based solution, i.e. when you don't have a domain controller and you're just sharing files from multiple workstations. It looked like I'd therefore need LAN Requester, and fortunately the Help button confirms that. If we select Peer for OS2, we can see that it confirms this is for plain workgroup sharing. That can be with or without specific servers, but it's definitely without a domain controller. If we click Previous, and then select LAN Requester 4, then we can see this is the client we need to log on to a LAN server domain. So that's the one that I installed. We also installed IBM TCP/IP because that's a quick and easy way for us to confirm that networking is working, just by using ping and NSLookup. Okay, well I'm going to cancel out of all this now because I've installed all those already and I don't want to make any changes. Let's take a look and see what drives we presently have on this laptop. So we go to OS2 System and then Drives. And as you can see, I have a drive C on which OS2 is installed. Drive D has DOS 6 and Windows 3.1, and I use OS2's Boot Manager to boot that partition on startup if I want to. Drive E is of course my CD-ROM drive. Okay, let's close those and log on to the domain. To do that, we go to IBM LAN Services and then log on. As you can see, the domain name is already Rick's Labs. So I just enter my username and password, and then I click on OK. Just like on the server, this does take a moment or so to get us logged on. Alright, now that we're logged on, let's take another look at those drives. So it's back to OS2 System, and then Drives. And you can see I've got a new drive now, Drive H. And if we double click that, we can see the text file that we created earlier. Let's open the file to be sure. Yes, perfect. If you remember, we also added my account to a couple of groups and gave it access to the Finance, HR and IT shared folders. Let's see how those work. We go to the Network folder on the desktop and we select LAN Server Resource Browser. This shows our server WoodOwl, and it also shows aliases for domain RixLabs. When we set up the shared folders earlier on, I said I'd come back to this aliases point. If we double click on aliases now, we can see all shared folders on the RixLab domain regardless of which physical server is sharing those folders. So it's a little like DFS in Microsoft Windows Server. The users can connect to a share at the domain level without needing to know the server name. That has many benefits, including being able to move those shared files and folders to a different server if you need to do some long-term maintenance on the original server. It also means that all of your shared folders are in one place without having to remember as a user which folders are on which server. Well, there they all are, so let's take a look at Finance, and then Finance again, and there's our file. We'll double click on it, and we can see the contents of that file. We can also map network drives, just like we do in Windows today. We go back to our list of aliases. We right-click IT and assign drive. We'll give it a drive letter of I and click OK. And now if I close these windows and I go back to OS2 System and then Drives, we can see our new drive I. I can double click it and we can see our three subfolders. And if I go into our Docs subfolder, we can see the document we created earlier in Notepad. And there it is. If you remember, when we created the IT share, we gave access to Richard, but we didn't give access to Chloe. Let's just make sure that's working correctly. To do that, we need to log off as Richard and log on as Chloe. So it's back to the desktop, and then IBM LAN Services, and log off. And if we now go back to OS2 System and then Drives, we can see that both our Drive H and our Drive I have gone. Alright, let's go back to IBM LAN Services and log on. And this time we're going to log on as Chloe. We give it a moment for the logon to complete. Okay. Now it's back to OS2 System and Drives, and there's our new Drive H. Let's double click it to make sure that it's definitely assigned the right shared folder to Chloe. Yes, all good. Okay, so let's take a look at those network aliases again. So that was back to the desktop, then Network, LAN Server Resource Browser, aliases for domain RixLabs. Once again, we can see our three shared folders, Finance, HR, and IT. And if we try and go into Finance, it works just fine. If we try and go into IT, well, it just hangs. It doesn't give me a graceful error message, it just sits there. And I can't even double click any other folders. It does eventually time out, and then all those other folders I was trying to double click, pop open. So that's good insofar as the permissions are being respected, but it's not good insofar as it's a little confusing to the user, especially if they believe they should have access to that folder. I expect that caused a few help desk tickets in its time. Well, that's it for this video. Our last step before shutting down is to log off the network. And that's it. And then we shut down. As always, thank you very much for watching. See you next time.